That stand comes down by Friday, or we tow it, padlock your driveway, and lien the property. This is a residential community, not a flea market. That was Diane Vesper, president of the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association, for 9 years running, standing at the end of my gravel lane on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2019, reading off a clipboard she held like a subpoena. The stand she wanted gone was a cedar farm table I had built with my own hands, set on a parcel my family had farmed since before her subdivision had a name. What she did not know, what she never once bothered to check in 4 years of letters and fines, was that the gravel road her precious Saturday farmers market sat on did not belong to the county, and it did not belong to her association. It belonged to a private easement my grandfather had deeded out in 1948, and the underlying strip was for sale. If you stood at the end of your own driveway, and a woman in pearls told you that the dirt your grandfather cleared was now hers to regulate, what would you have done? My name is Walt Brennan. I am 61 years old, and for 34 years I was a land surveyor for the county before I retired to run the last 40 acres of what used to be the Brennan place full-time. I know how to read a plat map the way some men read a sports page. I know where the monuments are buried, the iron pins and the old stone corners, because half of them I reset myself. I have crawled through more brush chasing a corner pin than I could ever count, and I have stood in a courtroom 4 separate times in my career and explained to a judge why a fence built on a guess was sitting 11 feet inside the wrong man's land. The lesson took every one of those 34 years to learn all the way down, and the lesson is simple. The ground does not lie. People lie about the ground all the time, but the ground itself, and the paper that describes it correctly, never does. The farm sits at the bottom of a shallow valley, pasture and orchard, and a creek that runs even in August. And the developers who built Maple Hollow in the 90s bought the ridge above us and left the bottomland alone because it flooded. There are 40 acres of it, give or take the half acre the creek has stolen since I was a boy. My grandfather cleared the upper field by hand and by mule, and he set the locust posts along the lane himself. Locust because it does not rot. And some of those posts were 80 years in the ground when this story started. My father ran beef on it. I ran a little of everything on it, because a surveyor's pay is steady, but it is not generous, and 40 acres will feed a family if you are not too proud to work all of it. My wife Carol and I raised our daughter on that ground. Carol grew up 2 valleys over, and she took to the farm the way some people take to a religion. All the way, no hesitation. She was the one who started the stand the first summer we were married, with a card table and a hand-lettered sign and a cigar box for the money. She sold sweet corn and tomatoes and the honey from the hives she kept along the orchard fence, and she sold it on the honor system. And in 29 summers she never once came up short at the end of a day, which tells you something about the people who used to pull off that county road. Carol passed 4 years before any of this started. The cancer took 11 months, and near the end of it, in the hospital, with her hand light as a leaf in mine, she asked me to keep the stand running. She did not ask me to keep the farm because she knew I would keep the farm the way I keep my own name. She asked about the stand, the small thing, the card table that had become a cedar table I built her one winter. I told her I would. That is a promise I made to a dying woman, and a homeowners association decided it was a code violation, so I kept it running. That was the whole crime. A cedar table I had planed, and joined by hand a hand-painted price list Lacey did in Carol's old paint, a coffee can for the money on the honor system the way Carol always ran it. And it sat at the mouth of my lane, on my ground, a good 200 feet outside the boundary of Diane Vesper's subdivision, on a strip of gravel that the county thought belonged to nobody and Diane thought belonged to her, and I knew for a fact I could put my finger on in a book, belonged to me. I want to tell you about the road, because the road is the whole story, and most people drove past it for years without understanding what they were looking at. When my grandfather sold off the building lots on the ridge in 1948, he did it sitting at the same kitchen table I still eat at, with a lawyer from town and a pot of coffee, and he did one thing that day that saved my farm 70 years later, though he could not have known it. He kept the bottomland, and he granted the new owners, up top, an easement to cross his property so they could reach the main county road. An easement is a right to use land you do not own. It is one of the most misunderstood words in America, and it was misunderstood expensively by Diane Vesper. The people on the ridge could drive across the strip. They could not own it, pave it without permission, or regulate what happened on it. My grandfather kept the underlying fee, the actual dirt, in the family, and the deed spelled it out in a sentence I could recite to you, with my eyes closed. Because it reserves to the grantor and his heirs the fee simple title to the strip described, subject only to the right of passage. The right of passage, not the right of ownership, not the right of regulation, the right to drive home. That is all the ridge ever got, and that is all they were ever entitled to, and it was written down in a book at the county clerk's office, where it had sat for 70 years. Public, free, waiting, for anyone with the patience to go pull it. When the developer platted Maple Hollow on top of those old lots in 1994, they inherited the easement, the right to cross. They never inherited the road itself, because the road itself was never the seller's to give. You cannot sell what you do not own, and the developer did not own that strip any more than I own the highway in front of my own mailbox. I had the original deed in a fireproof box in my office, and I'd read it so many times I could recite the metes and bounds in my sleep, the bearings and distances that walk the strip corner to corner, the same corners I had personally found and verified in the field in 1991. Hold on to that. It matters more than anything, Diane said into a clipboard. The first notice came in the summer of 2015. It was a single sheet on association letterhead taped to my cedar table with painter's tape, informing me that commercial activity was prohibited in the community and that I was in violation of Covenant Section 4. I read it twice, walked it up to my office, and started a manila folder. I wrote the date on the tab. I had spent 34 years learning that the man with the dated record wins, and the man who argues at the gate loses. So I did not drive up to the clubhouse to argue, I filed it. Notice 1. I did mail Diane a polite letter. I told her in plain words that my farm stand was not located within the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association, that my property predated the subdivision, and that I would be glad to walk the boundary with her. She never answered that letter. What I learned later was that she read it aloud at a board meeting and called it, and I am quoting a board member who was there, the sort of rural nonsense we are trying to zone out of this corridor. That word, corridor, stuck with me. People do not use the word corridor about a gravel lane unless they are thinking about what they could build along it. The second notice came that fall, and this one carried a fine $200 for continued commercial use. I filed it. Notice 2. The third came the following spring, taped over the second, $400 now. The fine doubling the way these things do when nobody pays them, and nobody is meant to pay them, because the point was never the money. The point was the paper, and the paper was building a case Diane thought she was winning. I filed it. Notice 3. I never paid a cent, because you cannot be fined by a homeowners association you do not belong to. any more than your neighbor can ticket your car. The first time Diane Vesper said anything to my face was in the early summer of 2016, and it set the pattern for everything after. I was restocking the stand on a Saturday morning, a flat of tomatoes in my arms, when a golf cart came down the easement road from the subdivision and stopped at the edge of the gravel where it met my lane. She got out in white sneakers and a linen blazer, and she had the clipboard, always the clipboard, and she stood with the toes of her sneakers right at the line where she imagined her authority ended and was careful not to cross it, which told me she was not as sure of herself as her voice was. She said, "You've been notified 3 times now. I don't think you appreciate how serious the board is about community standards in this corridor." I set the tomatoes down on the cedar table. I told her level as I could that my stand was not in her community, that my family had owned the bottomland since before the ridge was platted, and that I would walk the boundary with her any afternoon she liked, with the deed in my hand. She looked at me the way you look at a man speaking a language you have decided not to learn. She said, "Everyone has a story about their grandfather." Then she got back in the cart and drove off. I went inside, wrote down the date and what she said, word for word, while it was fresh. Notice 4, except this one had a voice attached to it, and I underlined that in the folder, because Ray would later tell me a voice is worth 10 letters. By 2016, the fines on paper had crossed $2,000, and my daughter Lacey, who was 16 that year and lived with me, started photographing every notice the day it appeared. She would date the photo, save it to my computer and to a thumb drive she kept in her desk, and hand me the printout for the folder. She had Carol's handwriting and Carol's stubbornness. One evening she looked up from the scanner and said, "Dad, they think you're scared of them." I told her I was not scared of them. I was just waiting. She asked, "Waiting for what?" And I told her the truth, which is that I was waiting for them to do something they could not take back. That is the thing I want you to sit with. I knew 4 years before it ended, exactly how it ended. I just did not know yet which Saturday. The Saturday part came into focus in the spring of 2017, when Maple Hollow started its farmers market. They set up white tents in the gravel lot where the easement road widened near the county highway, the exact strip my grandfather had deeded, and they charged vendors $40 a table to sell the same sweet corn and tomatoes and honey that I was being fined for selling 200 feet away. Diane cut a ribbon with oversized scissors while a man from the local paper took a photo. There was a banner strung between 2 of the tents and a brass band recording playing from a speaker on a card table. The irony was so thick, I could have spread it on toast, and I will admit I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched the whole thing through the glass and laughed out loud for the first time in a long while. The kind of laugh that surprises you. They had built their entire enterprise, their banner and their $40 tables and their destination market dreams, on the one piece of ground in the whole valley that was most provably, most recordably, not theirs. They were standing on my family's dirt, charging strangers rent to do it, and fining me for doing the same thing as stones throw away on dirt that was equally mine. I filed a photograph of the ribbon cutting, not as a notice, as evidence. The escalations came faster after the market opened, because now there was money in it, and money makes people bold. In the summer of 2017, a man showed up at my stand in a polo shirt with a laminated badge clipped to his pocket, calling himself a community compliance inspector. He had a clipboard too and a measuring wheel, and he had started rolling the wheel along the edge of my gravel before I had even come down from the house. He told me he was there to document my violations for the county. I asked him which county office he worked for. He could not name one. He said he worked with the county, which is a different word and a smaller one. The badge I saw when he got close had been run off a home printer, and slid into a plastic sleeve, the toner already wearing at the fold. I asked him, polite as I could manage, to leave my property, and when he started in about obstruction, I said it one more time, the same words, the way you do with a dog that has not decided yet whether you mean it. He left. I filmed him doing it on Lacey's old phone, the whole walk back to his car, the magnetic sign on the door that he peeled off before he reached the highway. That footage went to 2 drives that night. Incident 6. I had stopped calling them notices by then. I was counting incidents, and a man impersonating a county official on my land was a different animal than a letter taped to a table. I drove to the sheriff's substation that week. Not to file a complaint, just to ask a question. And that is where I met Deputy Ray Olson. Ray was maybe 40. Careful, the kind of man who reads the whole form before he signs it. I laid 3 of the photos on the counter and told him the short version. He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. Then he told me something I have repeated to a dozen neighbors since. He said, "Walt, if she files a complaint, even a junk one, I have to roll on it. The law makes me show up. What I can't do is make a call about whose rights standing in your driveway. You build me a pattern, dated, photographed, a stack I can hand a prosecutor. And the day it tips all at once." Then he asked me a question I have never forgotten. He asked how many documented incidents I had. I told him 6. He nodded slow, like a man pricing a load of hay. He said when it gets to be a real stack, when somebody crosses from paper into property, bring it in, and he would know what to do with it. That conversation changed how I filed. I was not keeping a grudge folder anymore. I was building a case, and a constrained, honest man in a uniform had just told me exactly how thick it needed to get. Then I found out about Carl. Carl Vesper was Diane's husband, and Carl Vesper ran a development company 2 counties over. I did not go looking for this. It came to me the ordinary way, over a fence, the way most true things in the country arrive. A rancher named Pete Doyle, who had a spread on the far side of the ridge and sold beef at the very market that had banned me by proxy, pulled into my lane one evening near dusk and sat in his truck with the window down, the engine still running, the way a man does when he is not sure he should be saying what he came to say. He took his time. He talked about the weather and the price of feeder calves, and then he got to it. He said the market vendors had been told there would be a permanent pavilion built the following year, a covered structure, paved parking, the works, and that the association was raising assessments to fund it. He said the figure he had heard was an extra $1,800 a household, and that some of the older folks on the ridge were not happy about it. He said Carl Vesper's company had the contract. He said something else that made me set down my coffee on the dash. He said the engineering drawings he had glimpsed at a vendor meeting tacked to an easel while a man in a sport coat talked about Phase 2, showed the pavilion and the parking lot extending well down the gravel road. Down past the market lot, down the easement. Toward the mouth of my lane, I asked Pete if he was sure about the drawings. He said he was a cattleman, not an engineer, but he knew which way a property line ran, and the colored area on that drawing ran straight at my mailbox. Then he put his truck in gear and said the thing that I have always been grateful for. He said, "Walt, I don't know what you've got down here, but if you've got anything, this is the year to have it." Then he drove off up the ridge. That was the night the petty became the profitable. Diane had not been fining me for 4 years because a cedar table offended her sense of aesthetic harmony. She had been clearing the board, softening me up, building a paper trail of her own to paint me as a nuisance. so that when Carl's company moved to pave and build down that road, the troublesome old farmer with the illegal stand would already be on record as the problem, the obstacle, the man who would not get with the program. They wanted the road. They had always wanted the road. And the road was the one thing in this entire valley that I could prove, with a document older than the subdivision, was not theirs to take. I did the only thing a careful man does when he learns the ground under a scheme is hollow. I went to the county to see who owned the underlying fee of that gravel strip. I spent the better part of 3 days in the recorder's office that fall, the way I used to spend whole weeks there in my working life, pulling the big leather books down off the shelves and reading the conveyances forward from 1948, deed to deed, name to name, following the strip the way you follow a creek to its source. And here, the years of escalation paid their first real dividend, because the answer was complicated, in exactly the way that favored me. The easement was recorded, clean, never disputed. The fee, the actual ownership of the dirt, had been split off in my grandfather's old conveyance, just as the deed in my box said, and had passed through a tangle of estate paperwork in the 1960 seconds, when one of my great-uncles died without a clear will, to a holding parcel that was now, after everyone in the chain had died, technically orphaned. Nobody had paid the taxes on it in years because nobody alive knew they owed them. The heirs were scattered across 3 states and uninterested. The county had it on a list of parcels eligible for a quiet title purchase at a delinquent tax sale, and almost nobody knew the strip existed as a separate parcel, because for 70 years everyone had just called it the road and assumed the road belonged to whoever the road served. I knew it existed. I had surveyed the corner myself in 1991 and noted the anomaly in my green field book in pencil, a separate sliver of ownership that did not match the tax map. And I had flagged it then as a title problem somebody would someday have to clean up. I had kept that field book because I keep everything. I went home and found the page and read my own handwriting from 27 years before, and it was like a younger man had reached forward through time to hand the older one a key. So in the fall of 2018, I bought the road. The sale itself was almost comically ordinary, which is how the most important things tend to be. It was a Thursday morning in a county meeting room with bad fluorescent light and folding chairs, 6 or 7 people there, most of them sleepy investors with spreadsheets looking for tax-delinquent lots to flip. The strip came up on the list with a legal description and a minimum bid, and not one soul in that room. But me knew what it was, or where it was, or why it would ever matter. I bid the minimum. Nobody bid against me. The clerk read my name, and that was that. I drove the cashier's check to the recorder's window that same afternoon and recorded the deed before the ink on the county stamp was dry, because a deed you have bought but not recorded is a promise, and a deed you have recorded is a wall. I want to be precise because precision is the whole point. I did not buy the easement. The Maple Hollow homeowners kept their legal right to drive across it to reach their houses, and I never once tried to block a resident from getting home, because that would have made me the villain Diane had spent 4 years trying to cast me as. What I bought, at a public tax sale, with a cashier's check, recorded the same afternoon at the county clerk's window, was the underlying fee of the strip of ground their farmer's market sat on, the dirt where Carl Vesper wanted to pour his parking lot. I owned it now, the same as my grandfather had. The title run back together into one unbroken chain, and the new deed went into the fireproof box next to his. I told no one but Lacey and Pete Doyle. Lacey, who was a sophomore in college by then, drove home that weekend and read the new deed at the kitchen table, and she got very quiet. And then she said, So they've been holding their market on your land this whole time. I said that they had. She asked what I was going to do. I told her I was going to do exactly what I had done for 4 years. Nothing. I was going to wait for them to do something they could not take back. It took them until the following spring. The escalation that crossed the line came in April of 2019, and it came, as these things do, on a Saturday morning when I had a stand to set up. I came down my lane at 7 with a truck bed full of early greens and found a contractor's crew, 3 men and a skid steer, setting survey stakes and orange flags down the length of the gravel road, well past the market lot, stopping just short of my mailbox. They had a notice zip-tied to my gatepost. It said the association, acting under its authority over community common areas, had approved improvements to the roadway, and that my farm stand and a section of my fence were encroaching and would be removed to make way for construction. It was signed by Diane Vesper, president. The skid steer had already torn out 40 feet of my grandfather's locust fence posts, and they lay in the ditch like pulled teeth. That was incident 19, and it was the one I had been waiting 4 years for, because the difference between a fine I could ignore and a crime I could prosecute is the difference between a letter and a man on a machine tearing out your fence on ground you hold the deed to. I did not yell at the crew. I want you to hear that. I have replayed that morning 100 times, and I am still proud of the next 5 minutes, because everything in me wanted to. Instead, I called Lacey, who was home for the weekend, and told her to bring the folder and the fireproof box down to the road and to start filming. Then I called Deputy Ray Olson, and I said the words he had told me to save for the day it tipped. I said, "Ray, I've got a stack now, and I've got men with a machine destroying improvements on a parcel I hold recorded fee title to. How fast can you get here?" He said 12 minutes. He made it in 9. By the time Ray's cruiser came down the gravel, Diane Vesper had arrived too, because someone on the crew had called her, and she came out of her white SUV in a magenta blazer and pearls and kitten heels that sank into the soft shoulder of the road. She told Ray that I was interfering with a lawfully approved community improvement project, that the road was a common area under association control, and that she wanted me cited for harassment and the stand removed today. She said, and Lacey caught every word of it on 2 phones, "This man does not seem to understand that this entire road is functionally part of our jurisdiction." Ray looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at me. He did not raise his voice the whole time, and that is the part the market crowd that had started to gather kept talking about afterward, how quiet it all was. He asked me if I had documentation of ownership. I said I did. And here is the moment I had carried in my chest for 4 years. I did not make a speech. I want you to know that I had earned a speech, and I did not give one, because Carol would have rolled her eyes at a speech, and because the deed says it better than I ever could. I opened the fireproof box on the lowered tailgate of my truck. I took out a single sheet, the recorded deed from the tax sale, county stamp in the corner, dated and recorded the previous fall. I laid it flat on the tailgate so Ray could read it without taking it from my hand. Then I laid my grandfather's 1948 conveyance beside it, the original, the one that split the fee from the easement, so the chain ran unbroken across 70 years on a truck tailgate in the morning sun. Ray read both. He read them twice, his finger moving along the bearings, the way a man checks a map against a road. The market crowd had gone quiet. Diane had stopped talking, which I had never once seen her do. For a moment, the only sound was the creak and the tick of the skid steer's engine cooling. Then he turned to Diane and said, the thing that ended it, in the flat voice of a man who has just been handed the one fact that decides everything. He said, "Ma'am, this isn't a common area. This is his road. He owns the ground your market is sitting on. You need to stop your crew right now, because what they've been doing for the last hour is destroying his property." Nobody moved for a long second. I want to leave it there for a second too, because that second is the one I had been buying with 4 years of patience and a folder full of dated paper, and it was worth every dollar of fine I never paid. I have watched Lacey's footage of Diane Vesper's face in that moment, more times than I will admit. She did not have an answer, because there was no answer. For 4 years, she had escalated against a position she had never once checked, and the checking would have taken an afternoon at the county clerk's window, the same window where I had recorded my deed. She had filed, by my count from the folder, 19 separate documented actions against me. She had collected $0 of the fine she levied because not one of them was enforceable. And on the tailgate of my truck sat one document, recorded once, that erased all 19 at a stroke. 19 to 1. That is the number I think about. The crew shut off the skid steer. Ray told them to leave the stakes and the flags as evidence, and to get off the parcel they went. The consequence was not something I designed. I want to be clear about that, because the satisfying part of this is that I did not have to lift a finger to bring it down. I had bought the dirt. Everything that fell after that fell by its own weight. Carl Vesper's company had spent the winter drawing engineering plans for a pavilion and a paved lot on a parcel his own wife did not own. And when those plans went before the County Planning Commission that summer, I was a courtesy notice recipient. The notice arriving in my mailbox on the same kind of county letterhead Diane had spent 4 years imitating, I attended. I put on a clean shirt, and I drove to the county building. And I sat in the back with the folder on my knees and the fireproof box in the truck, and I waited through 2 hours of variance requests about setbacks and fence heights until they called the Maple Hollow Pavilion. A man in a sport coat presented the project, slides and renderings, the covered pavilion, the paved lot, the phase 2 that ran down the gravel road exactly as Pete had described. He talked about community amenities and economic vitality and a destination market. When he finished, the chair asked if anyone wished to speak. I stood up and gave my name and said I owned the land the project was drawn on, and I would be glad to show the commission the recorded title. I did not testify long. I did not need to. I laid the recorded chain of title in front of the commission, my grandfather's 1948 conveyance, and my own tax sale deed from the previous fall, and the commission's own counsel, a young woman who took about 90 seconds with the 2 documents, looked up and told the chair that the applicant did not appear to control the underlying real property, and that the commission could not approve a project on land the applicant did not own or hold an interest in. The man in the sport coat said there must be some mistake. The counsel said the recording was clear. The application was not denied so much as it evaporated. You cannot pave what you do not own. The chair tabled it, which is the polite government word for letting a thing die where it sits. The assessment the homeowners had been paying to fund that pavilion, $1,800 a household that Pete had told me about, became the subject of some very loud meetings I was not invited to, and heard about for months. People want their money back when the thing it was for turns out to have been built on a fairy tale. The board that had rubber-stamped Diane for 9 years did not rubber-stamp a 10th. A woman named Sandra Pell, who had sat silent on that board for years and had voted for every fine because she trusted that Diane had checked, stood up at the annual meeting that fall and did the thing that finished it. She had asked me, quietly, by phone, for the dates. I gave her the dates and nothing else, because the dates were enough. She stood up in front of the home membership and read the dates of the 19 actions the association had taken against me, into the record one at a time, the notices, the fines, the inspector, the crew, 4 years of them, and the room got quieter with each one. Then she read the single date of my recorded deed. Then she asked the room how a president could spend 4 years and, by the association's own attorney's estimate, tens of thousands of dollars in legal exposure, finding a man on land she had never once verified she controlled. Nobody had an answer. There was not one. Sandra called me afterward to say she was sorry she had not spoken sooner, that she had assumed for years that someone with a clipboard and a title had surely done the basic work of checking. I told her that assumption was the most expensive thing in the whole valley, and that speaking now counted. I meant it. She had voted wrong for years and found her feet in one evening, and I have never thought less of a person for being slow to a thing they've finally got to. Diane Vesper was voted out that fall, by a margin that was not close. The farmers' market still runs, by the way. It runs because I let it. I sent the new board a 1-page license the following spring, granting the market permission to use my parcel on Saturdays from May to October, for the sum of $1 a year, on the single condition that any vendor who wants a table gets one, including the old farmer at the bottom of the lane with the cedar stand and the honor system coffee can. They signed it within the week. Pete Doyle sells his beef there. I sell Carol's tomatoes off the same cedar table in the same gravel lot, the only difference being that now the ground under the tents and the ground under my stand are the same ownership, which is to say, finally, plainly, mine. Carl Vesper's company is fine. I want to say that too because this was never about ruining anybody. He builds subdivisions 2 counties over, and he builds them on land he owns, which is all I ever asked of anyone. He never came down my lane, and I never went up his ridge, and the only thing that fell was the thing they reached for that was never theirs. The fence is the part that matters most to me. The summer after it ended, Lacey came home, and the 2 of us reset my grandfather's locust posts, the same ones the skid steer had pulled, into the same holes, because I had photographed the holes before they filled. And we strung new wire along the line my grandfather walked and I surveyed, and Carol drove past every summer of her life with a truck full of corn. Lacey tamped the last post with the flat of a shovel the way I taught her, and she stood up and looked down the road that was ours again, and she said, "Mom would have loved this. She would have. She would have laughed first and then she would have loved it. I want to tell you what to take from this, because that is the whole reason I am telling it, instead of just living it. If you own a piece of ground, walk your boundary. Find your corners. Pull your deed and read it, the actual recorded deed, not the survey the realtor handed you. And read the deeds it references back as far as the chain goes, because the answer to almost every fight you will ever have is already written down in a book at the county clerk's office, and it has been sitting there the whole time, waiting for somebody to be patient enough to go read it. When somebody with a clipboard tells you what you can and cannot do on your own land, do not argue at the gate. Smile, say nothing, and go file. Date everything. Photograph everything. Keep 2 copies. The person who keeps the record wins, and they win quietly, and they win for keeps. Authority that never checks the ground it stands on is just a costume, and costumes come off the moment someone hands a deputy a deed. If a story like this happened to you, tell me about it in the comments, because I read them, and somebody else who is being fined right now for something on their own land needs to hear that it can end the way mine did. If you want more of these, subscribe, and I will keep telling them. Next time I will tell you about the man who was ordered to drain the pond his great-grandfather dug by an HOA that did not know the pond was a registered water right, older than the state's own dam downstream. Walk your boundary. I will see you down the road.